The air inside Willow Creek Grocery was thick with the mundane hum of everyday life. Shoppers moved lazily between aisles, carts creaking under the weight of weekly provisions. The faint aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the bakery, mingling with the sterile chill of the produce section. It was a picture of ordinary suburbia, until it wasn't. Near the display of ripe, sun-kissed apples, Eleanor Grayson, a woman in her late 70s, adjusted her glasses. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, her cardigan faded but immaculate. She exuded an air of order and routine, her movements brisk yet deliberate. Just as she reached for a polished red apple, a young man, tall, with dark skin and a kind demeanor, stepped into the aisle. His name was Michael Hayes, casually dressed in a navy sweatshirt and jeans. A grocery basket balanced effortlessly on one arm as he scrolled through his phone with the other. The collision of their presence seemed innocuous at first. Michael nodded politely as he reached for a bag of oranges nearby, his actions calm and unassuming. But Eleanor's expression shifted abruptly, her lips tightening into a thin line. Her voice, though soft at first, carried an unmistakable sharpness as she spoke. "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" she said, loud enough to draw the attention of several nearby shoppers. The words sliced through the atmosphere like a blade. Michael froze, his hand hovering over the oranges, his phone forgotten. Around them, the gentle hum of the store faltered as those within earshot paused, their faces a mix of shock and unease. A young mother near the bread aisle instinctively pulled her child closer, while a clerk stocking bananas a few feet away dropped a bundle to the floor. Michael slowly raised his gaze to meet Eleanor's, his face calm, but his eyes brimming with disbelief. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching like an invisible chasm between them. He didn't react immediately, his fingers tightening around the basket handle as he took a deep breath. The crowd waited, some in morbid curiosity, others in quiet dread, to see what he would do. For Michael, the moment demanded more than a reaction. It required a response, one that could shift the weight of Eleanor's words and remind everyone watching of the humanity they shared. Jackson's initial reaction was a mixture of shock and disbelief. The words Eleanor had uttered struck him like a cold gust of wind, but he didn't let it show. He stood still, his expression unreadable, as if carefully deciding his next move. The room seemed to hold its breath along with him, the hum of the refrigerators in the background, now eerily loud. He finally shifted, straightening his posture and locking his gaze on Eleanor. Placing his basket down on the floor with deliberate care, Jackson took a step forward, not aggressively, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced prejudice before and learned how to rise above it. "Ma'am," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "Do you even realize what you just said?" His tone wasn't angry or confrontational. It was measured, almost inviting her to reconsider her words. Eleanor, however, crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes hardening. "I said what I said," she replied sharply. "This is my country, and people like you don't belong here." The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. A young mother near the dairy section quickly steered her child away, while a cashier craned her neck to see what was happening. Jackson's jaw tightened for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He inhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing as he prepared his response. "Let's talk about that," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Since you brought it up, let me tell you a little about where I come from." The room fell silent. Even those who had initially tried to ignore the exchange now found themselves drawn in. Jackson's calm demeanor was disarming, his words commanding attention without the need for volume or force. "My great-grandfather was born here," Jackson began, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "Not just in this country, but in a small town not far from here. He was a sharecropper, working the land with his bare hands so his children could have a better future. His father, though," Jackson's voice faltered for a moment, a flicker of emotion breaking through. "His father was brought here in chains, sold like property, and forced to build a country that didn't see him as a man." The crowd's silence deepened, the weight of history palpable. Eleanor's expression flickered, her confidence faltering ever so slightly. Jackson's words hung in the air, a quiet power emanating from his steady voice. It wasn't just Eleanor he addressed. It was everyone in the room, everyone who had ever stood silent in the face of prejudice, and everyone who had ever been its target. The moment transcended the small produce aisle, transforming into something larger. The first to respond was a man in a faded baseball cap, his voice breaking the thick silence. "He's right," the man said, stepping forward. "We've got to be better than this." His words, simple yet profound, rippled through the crowd like a pebble dropped in water. A young cashier near the registers, barely out of her teens, with wide eyes and a nervous demeanor, called out from her station. "Thank you for saying something," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "It's something we all needed to hear." Eleanor stood rooted in place, her hands gripping her cart tightly. Her face, once defiant and firm, now revealed a storm of emotions: embarrassment, confusion, and something deeper. Shame. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Her gaze flickered around the room, searching for support, but found none. Jackson turned back to her, his voice softer, but no less resolute. "Words matter, ma'am. Actions matter even more. It's never too late to be better." The crowd watched, their collective silence speaking volumes. An older woman near the dairy section nodded slowly, her expression one of quiet reflection. "My father used to say the same thing," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "He always believed in kindness, no matter what." Jackson took a step back, his presence commanding but not overbearing. He didn't need to say more. His message had already landed. But the room was far from finished processing what had happened. "You know," another voice chimed in, this one belonging to a middle-aged man near the bread aisle. "It's easy to look away, but he's right. We got to call out what's wrong when we see it. Otherwise, nothing changes." The murmurs of agreement grew louder, spreading across the store. People began to exchange nods, their faces a mix of determination and newfound awareness. The quiet hum of the store's routine had been replaced by a palpable sense of solidarity. Eleanor's knuckles whitened as she clutched her cart. For a moment, she looked at Jackson, and her expression softened. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving the cart behind. Her departure wasn't a victory, but perhaps the first step toward understanding. Eleanor left the store in silence, her head bowed and her cart abandoned near the entrance. The weight of Jackson's words stayed with her as she walked through the parking lot, the sun casting long shadows across the pavement. She avoided meeting anyone's eyes, the murmurs of the onlookers still ringing in her ears. But while Eleanor retreated, the impact of the encounter began to ripple outward. Jackson's courage had ignited something within the community. By the time the story spread beyond the grocery store, it wasn't just a tale of confrontation, but a catalyst for change. Neighbors who rarely exchanged more than polite greetings now found themselves engaging in deeper conversations. They shared their own experiences with prejudice, resilience, and the moments that had shaped their perspectives. At home that evening, Eleanor sat in her living room, her untouched dinner growing cold on the table. Jackson's voice echoed in her mind, each word cutting through years of hardened assumptions. For the first time in decades, she thought about her own family struggles. Her grandparents, immigrants who arrived in America with nothing but hope, had faced countless challenges to carve out a life for themselves. She had heard those stories as a child, but had pushed them aside, choosing to focus instead on her own frustrations and fears. Now, those memories resurfaced, vivid and undeniable. She saw parallels she had once refused to acknowledge. Her grandfather's weathered hands after long days in the fields. Her mother's stories of being excluded because of her accent. They had fought for acceptance, just as Jackson's family had. The realization was humbling and deeply unsettling. Meanwhile, Jackson's actions continued to resonate in the community. A local pastor brought up the story during Sunday service, urging the congregation to reflect on their own biases. A teacher at the nearby middle school used it as a discussion point in her classroom, encouraging students to think critically about the power of words and the importance of empathy. Social media buzzed with retellings of the event, many commending Jackson's grace under pressure. Eleanor found herself scrolling through some of those posts late at night. The comments varied from praise for Jackson's courage to introspective admissions from others who had confronted their own prejudices. One comment stood out: "It's never too late to change. The first step is listening." She closed her laptop and sat in the dark, the screen's glow fading. For the first time in years, Eleanor didn't feel certain about her beliefs. And for the first time, she wondered if that uncertainty could lead to something better. The grocery store incident quickly became a story that transcended its walls, sparking conversations that reached far beyond the small Ohio neighborhood. Jackson found himself at the center of these discussions, though not by choice. He wasn't seeking attention or validation, but his calm, courageous response to prejudice resonated deeply with those who heard about it. One afternoon, as Jackson walked through the local park, an older woman approached him hesitantly. Her white hair framed a kind face lined with years of experience. "You're the man from the store, aren't you?" she asked softly. When he nodded, she reached out and grasped his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You gave me hope. We could do better, can't we?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke, and Jackson felt the sincerity in her words. Encounters like these became more frequent. Strangers would stop him to express their gratitude or share their own stories of overcoming prejudice and ignorance. Some offered apologies for times they had stayed silent when they should have spoken up. Each interaction reinforced Jackson's belief that change, though slow and sometimes painful, was possible. Meanwhile, Eleanor's life had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. Jackson's words lingered in her mind, challenging her to confront beliefs she had held for decades. She began to read books about history, stories of struggle, resilience, and triumph that she had never taken the time to understand. Late at night, she found herself watching documentaries that shed light on experiences she had once dismissed. Each new piece of information chipped away at the walls she had built around herself. Eleanor's transformation wasn't immediate, but it was genuine. She started to see the world through a lens of shared humanity, recognizing that her own family struggles were not so different from those of others. Though she wasn't sure if she'd ever cross paths with Jackson again, she hoped she'd have the chance to apologize. More importantly, she wanted to prove to herself and others that change was possible. The ripple effects of that day in the store continued to spread, planting seeds of change in unexpected places. Jackson's quiet strength had done more than silence hate. It had inspired a community to reflect, learn, and strive for something better. The crisp autumn air carried the sounds of laughter and conversation through the park, where the community had gathered for a local festival. Food trucks lined the sidewalks, children darted between booths, and neighbors exchanged warm greetings. Amid the cheerful chaos, Eleanor stood near the edge of the crowd, clutching a cup of coffee, her heart pounding as she spotted Jackson. He was standing near a stage, listening to a speaker, his calm demeanor unchanged. For months, Eleanor had replayed their encounter in her mind, her guilt and regret growing with each passing day. She had rehearsed what she might say if she ever saw him again, but now, faced with the opportunity, her courage wavered. "It's now or never," she whispered to herself. Taking a deep breath, she made her way through the crowd, her steps slow but determined. When she reached him, Jackson turned, his expression shifting from surprise to recognition. "Jackson," Eleanor began, her voice trembling. "I was wrong." The words felt heavy, but they were the truth. "I said things I should never have said. And I hope you can forgive me." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she spoke. For a moment, Jackson was silent, studying her with the same calm intensity that had defined his response in the grocery store. Then he smiled, a warm and genuine expression that seemed to lift the weight from her shoulders. He extended his hand. "It's not about forgiveness," he said gently, his voice steady. "It's about moving forward together." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before taking his hand. Their handshake was firm but unhurried, a quiet moment of connection amid the bustling festival. Around them, the noise of the event seemed to fade, as if the world was holding its breath to honor their reconciliation. That simple act carried a profound message, one that radiated outward. Nearby, a group of onlookers who had witnessed the exchange began to applaud softly, the gesture spreading until it became a wave of support. Jackson and Eleanor turned to see the smiles and nods of encouragement surrounding them. The festival continued, but something had shifted. The handshake wasn't just a moment of personal growth. It was a symbol of what the community could achieve when grace and courage replaced hate and division. Together, they showed that change was possible, one step at a time.